global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Good morning, everybody. Well, the royal wedding is absolutely dominating everything. One Sunday newspaper has 47 pages of photographs, and if you look across other news media, radio, television this morning, there's almost a competition going on from public figures to sort of outbid each other in saying how wonderful the whole day was. Well, it was rather special. I was down there on Thursday, 48 hours before. I thought the atmosphere was quite extraordinary. I think the whole thing is a magnificent advert for the country. The weather was perfect. And sure, there's lots to talk about, and we will talk about it from somebody who was there yesterday. But other things are going on. And there's a really, I think, very big story out there. And you'd struggle if you went through today's newspapers to really find it. The Sunday Times have done more on it than anybody else. But it's what's going on in Italy. Often we get the impression in this country from those that wish us to remain in the European Union and would like to force a second referendum on us that we're the ones with the problem. But everything in Brussels and across the EU is hunky-dory. Well, it's not, is it? Remember Catalonia. Remember what's going on with Poland, with Hungary. Big arguments with the European Commission. But tomorrow, a new government will be formed in Italy. It is made up of the Lega, who before were the Northern League. They've dropped the northern bit in a bid to get votes across the whole of Italy, and they're joining up with the Five Star movement. The Lega are on the right of politics, Five Star are just a bit to the left. I know both of these parties very well. I sat for 10 years in the European Parliament with the Lega, and I currently sit with the Five Star movement, and the founder of it, Beppe Grillo, and I did a deal back in 2014. We have before seen a government in Greece elected saying that it would break all of the rules, and then, in the face of Brussels deciding not to. I wonder, how significant is this Italian government tomorrow? And to help us through that, I'm going to go to Peter Foster, Europe editor of the Daily Telegraph. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Nigel.
How big a moment do you believe this is?
I think potentially it's an enormous moment. I'm delighted that you're leading the show with it. I think that will look like a wise decision in a few months' time. Since the bond crisis in 2012, as you know, there's just been a succession of technocratic governments in Italy, starting with Mario Monti, which has sort of masked the fact that Italy, which is the third biggest country in the Eurozone, has fallen out of love with Europe in a spectacular fashion. And this government will give an extraordinary mouthpiece to that. The extent to which, as you say, they can break the rules from Brussels is going to be fascinating. You know, they're introducing in their programme at least a minimum income. They want to scrap the pension reforms, which was seen as the sort of benchmark of Italian structural reforms. If they did everything that they have in their programme, they'd see the budget deficit hit nearly 6% of GDP. As you know, that's
which is double what they're allowed to do.
Which is double what they're allowed to do. And you saw the bond markets tightening pretty hard the back end of last week. So, there will be a standoff, I think, between the markets, sell-off on the Italian stock market as well by internationals. But I think that the really key thing here is that even if the leaders are unable to push through a lot of these policies, when they start to hit the kind of reality buffer, guess who they're going to blame? They're going to blame the Ayatollahs of austerity in Brussels. They're going to blame a German-led
They're going to blame the Germans, aren't they?
Yeah, they're going to blame the Germans. And it's going to be messy. And, as you said at the top, Brexit, the wretched Brits, they were half out anyway. They weren't in Schengen. They weren't in the Euro. That Farage, he's always, we didn't want him anyway. Quite. And then the Hungarians and the Poles, they were never really Europeans, were they? God, we took them in because it was that, or, we had to kind of bring them in after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But, when you've got the third biggest, it's not called the Treaty of Rome for nothing, the third biggest economy in the Eurozone, basically coming to European summits. And we haven't talked about immigration policy, but essentially, adopting positions that are fundamentally, the antithesis of the core Eurozone. I mean, Mr. Macron's reforms now potentially look pretty shaky. So I think it is a big moment.
And a different attitude towards Russia as well.
Again, I mean, which Italy has had for a long time. If you talk to senior Italian officials, Italy, there's a lot of Russian money in Italian banks. There's a lot of Russian money in Italian property, and there's a lot of business interests between Italy and Russia. And they've always been lukewarm about the sanctions that were put on Russia after the Ukraine crisis. And again, it's one example of where, in the past, a sort of sensible technocratic government, Gentiloni, Renzi, Mario Monti. These people,
Monti, of course, he wasn't even elected, was he? He was just appointed.
No, there've been a number. I mean, that's the problem. And so these governments have been relied upon essentially to toe the line, the sort of sensible line in Brussels. The difficulty they've got now is that's no longer the case. And again, you expect, say, Hungary to be chafing. I interviewed Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. He said, look, we don't like these sanctions on Russia, but we're only a small country. What are we expected to do? Ultimately, we have to toe the line. Now, it will be really interesting to see the next time Russian sanctions come up. If this five-star Lega government holds, what are you going to do when Italy is around the table saying no? That's a much bigger problem than Hungary.
Now, when in Greece we saw a very left-wing government elected under Mr. Tsipras, Syriza was the name of the party, and they promised to break all of the rules. And I remember I saw Tsipras coming out of that meeting with the European Commission, and I looked straight into the eyes of a completely beaten man. I don't know what they threatened him with. I mean, goodness only knows. But suddenly, having been elected on this populist wave of we're not going to obey these German-dominated rules, he basically collapsed and caved. What pressure do you think they're going to try and bring on this new Italian government to toe the line?
I think there will be massive pressure, and it'll come partly from the markets. If it looks like, a bit like when Trump was elected, no one was quite sure what Trump was going to do. Was he really going to carry on? And it will be interesting to see whether they can, in the face of market pressure, which will build, once, Italian debt spreads, the gap between the price of an Italian bond and a German bond starts to widen, then you'll find, Italian debt to GDP ratio is 130%, and they will find themselves under huge pressure to finance, the cost of Italian debt, and that will, my guess is, probably limit what they can actually do, and then you're going to have more angry Italians because yet another government has failed to deliver on its promises, yet another government, and so that will push them to push the Europeans very hard. You see what I mean? You end up in a push and pull situation where the markets and the Eurozone authorities squeeze them to say, you just can't do this. But we've promised people, and the danger for the Europeans is that actually the government falls and you end up with even more angry Italians.
And they don't
solve the problem.
And they don't have, you could always argue in France and Germany, however imperfect Brussels is, 3 wars in the space of 70 years between those countries, there is some residual love for the project in both of those countries. Italy, of course, doesn't have any of that. Let me ask you, Peter, straight, do you think that this Italian government poses a bigger threat to the European Union project than Brexit?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I do.
Well, that's a pretty straight answer, and I'm with you 100%. Peter Foster, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That was Peter Foster, Europe editor of the Daily Telegraph, and that's the premise I'm putting to you. I think this poses a bigger threat to the future of the European Union than Brexit ever did. I've got Rhys from Lambeth on the line. Good morning, Rhys.
Good morning, Nigel.
Do you agree with my prognosis here?
Yes, I do, because the thing about the UK is we're not integrated into the euro currency the same way that Italy is. So if a country like the UK was to leave, or Denmark, or Sweden, or Hungary, it'll pose a threat, but not the biggest threat, because what holds the EU together mostly is the Schengen zone and the euro currency. Now, if Italy does leave the euro currency, it seems as though the five-star movement and Lega Nord, or Nord as it's now called, a backtracked. I still think if they decide to go forward with it, if Italy leaves, potentially other countries will leave the euro, and then the whole thing's pretty much kaput, isn't it?
Yeah, Rhys, I think that, and I understand Peter Foster's point that the markets will put pressure on. It may start to be difficult for the Italian government to borrow. They've got this massive, accumulated debt, which is 132% of annual GDP. So they've got some real the real problem, Rhys, is that Italy should never have joined the euro. It's been a catastrophic mistake.
Nigel, it's a terrible currency. It has caused so much misery for the Italians. I'm glad we never joined. If we did, bloody hell, where would we be now?
Well, I think if we joined it, I'm not sure Brexit would have happened, because I think the argument...
It would have been difficult for it to happen.
Yeah, because the argument, how do you unravel this, would have been very, very difficult indeed. Rhys, do you think the end of the European Union would be a good thing or potentially quite dangerous?
I'm probably going to say something that's going to offend a lot of people. I think we're one of the best things to happen to Europe since 1945. It was a terrible union. It's never been created. If it was just a common market, fine, but it's now become a political union. I'm glad we've left the bloody stupid thing. I hope
okay.
the same as well.
Enough of the B word this time on a Sunday morning. Rhys, thank you very much for your call. Marcus on Facebook says, the new Italian government and Brexit are both huge threats to Brussels. They know that the other European nations will follow soon. It's taking time, but the lions are roaring. Brexit was the start. Hubert says, a danger for a union of 27 countries, its leaders, and 450 million citizens, ? The EU economies are going from strength to strength. Britain has a lot of catching up to do. Well, Hubert, we've had times over the last 15 years when we have been growing more quickly than the Eurozone. Right now, the Eurozone is growing more quickly than we are. We have a productivity problem in this country. Lots of people in work, but not enough being produced. But the idea, as I said at the start, that we're the ones with the problem, that everything's fine and dandy in Brussels and around the member states, just isn't true. They are facing a really, really big problem. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively here on LBC, and it's now 10:15. So tomorrow, the Five-Star Movement and the League will go to the Italian president and they will form a new government. They have a platform. One or two of the early ideas, such as demanding Brussels write off 250 billion euros worth of debt, appear to have been dropped. But they are talking about the repatriation of 500,000 illegal migrants. They are talking about ending sanctions on Putin's Russia. They are talking about an affirmation that Italy is a Christian country. And they've got a whole raft of spending plans that would probably put them at double the limit for the size of their economy that is allowed by the Brussels rules. Now, the only question to be sorted out tomorrow is who is the Prime Minister going to be? No one quite knows, but I love this quote. There is a certain Silvio Berlusconi who has 9 years of experience in government and is available. Guess who said that? Silvio Berlusconi. So at 81 years old, he has decided that he wants to be the Prime Minister again. I don't think they're going to pick him. But it's interesting because Berlusconi's party, these two parties have 50% of the vote. Berlusconi's party is about another 16% of the vote. So what you're beginning to see is Italian mainstream politics is now very much of a Eurosceptic disposition. And Theo on Facebook makes a point of this. He says, surely this is a bigger threat to Brussels than Brexit because we're talking about a coalition of Eurosceptic parties, unlike Brexit. In Britain, the people may have opposed the EU, but not really the mainstream political parties. So, I think this does pose a very fundamental threat. There could be all sorts of market dislocation. I personally, of course, am not a fan of the European project. I think it'd be far better if sovereign states cooperated together rather than being run by the European Commission. That's my view. But Jason in Sutton, who's a regular caller to this show, often takes a different view. Good morning, Jason.
Good morning to you, Nigel. Good morning. Happy Sunday to you. Why is it you just pick on any country with a problem, you find the problem and then blame it on the European Union? It just fascinates me.
Well, Jason, what I'm saying, of course, is that joining the euro was a catastrophic error for the Italian economy. And they've basically had zero growth, Jason, for 20 years.
And yet, if Britain had joined the euro back in 1997, we would be 30% wealthier than we are today as a country in Britain.
You're having a laugh.
No, you can look at the fact.
Jason, if we joined the euro, we'd have been like Greece with our budget deficit. Goodness knows what would have happened to us. It would have been a catastrophe if we joined the euro.
Well, so say some, but we'll never know, will we, apart from the historical facts. But if you look at Italy, it's got 250 billion euros of debt with the other European Union countries.
Yep.
You can't say that that's the fault of the European Union.
No.
Countries. Where would they have gone if they were not members of the European Union? Where would they have had to go to get that money?
They had something called the lira, Jason, and And of course, the lira very often went through stages of competitive devaluation. Now, you could argue that a country that uses devaluation isn't actually tackling the social, economic problems that it's got itself. But the point is, as soon as you merge your currency with effectively the Deutschmark, because that's what they did, then unless your economy and your structures become like Germany's, you've got a problem. And you have two choices. With the lira, you could devalue your currency. With the euro, they've had to devalue the country. And I'm saying, Jason, they should never have joined the euro.
But that's one out of, 19 Eurozone countries?
Oh, there are many others. There are many others, Jason.
The same problem. What the problem is caused by is total mismanagement by a series of governments that don't know what they're doing in Italy, including the technocratic one. And this goes back a long time. It's nothing to do with the European Union or the currency. Otherwise, all 19 countries would have the same problem. You're picking one problem and blaming...
Jason, there is a cultural division between the north of Europe and the south of Europe. A cultural division in terms of attitudes towards work, a cultural attitude towards government, towards paying taxes. I mean, these differences, I believe these differences are irreconcilable. Now, I was arguing that, Jason, back in 1999, all the way through the formation of the euro, and frankly, those in Brussels thought, once we get them in the straitjacket, they will change their government, they'll become more efficient, they'll become more like the Germans. But it's very difficult to culturally change people.
Oh, hang on. The tax avoidance isn't just the policy of the Southern Europeans. I mean, there's yourself with the Isle of Man pension schemes.
Jason, let me tell you, Jason, I did business in Italy. £34
billion of unpaid corporate taxes in the UK. £34 billion is what we're losing. We're not collecting.
All right. So, Jason, are you saying to this show that culturally attitudes towards tax avoidance are the same in Britain and Germany as they are in Greece and Italy?
I don't think it's tax avoidance as such. It's more of a cash economy over there.
Jason, I'm sorry, but my 7 years of dealing with major Italian companies have taught me different. Anyway, we are where we are. Do you, Jason, think this Italian government poses a threat to the future of the European project?
I think it poses a threat to wider areas than that. I mean, I can't think of another sort of far-right fascist almost government in Italy since the Second World War.
Oh, please believe me, the Five Star Movement are more to the left of politics than they are to the right.
That's a good thing. I'm not so sure it is either.
Well, no, but the point I'm making is you can't call them fascist. I mean, Beppe Grillo, the stand-up comedian who founded that party, I mean, that party has what we would call a big social conscience. They're not right.
Saying they're not right-wing?
No, they're not right-wingers at all.
So how come you've been hanging out with them so much?
Because I've always, Jason, worked with people from the right, centre and left of politics to achieve my goals. And those that want to pigeonhole me somewhere, they've tried jolly hard, but they're losing. Jason, as ever, I thank you for your call. Messages flowing in. All thanks go to Italy for this favour to us. Let's hope the whole bucket blows up in Brussels' face and there'll be no EU for us to leave. Graham, I've been saying for years, I want us to leave before the whole thing falls to pieces. I would lose a great sense of satisfaction if we couldn't do this. Italy will put even more nails in the EU Commission's coffin. Perhaps it's time our Euro fanatics woke up and smelt the coffee. Richard, I keep saying this every week. The Lord Adonises and these people who want us to basically stay in the European Union, what are we staying in? We're staying in something that I think is increasingly fragmenting. John is calling from Los Beliches in Spain. Good morning to you.
Good morning to you. I'm more concerned. I think the Italian situation, they're probably putting enough pressure on Italy to the new government to water things down. But what concerns me more, what we don't hear too much about, is we've had a 10-year record of a bull market, as you know.
We have.
A record.
We have.
I think the Trumponomics has probably increased the chances of not having one in the next year or two. But, when crashes come, and I've basically seen them all, they come very fast and many, many people can't recognize them coming. And that, to me, is the biggest worry about the EU, because effectively Germany is going to have to put billions into Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean countries, countries, and I don't think the German people would want to put hundreds of billions in.
John, I mean, the politics of Germany is changing, isn't it? I mean, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, they are now second in the opinion polls in Germany.
Yep, understandable, and I don't think with that pressure that Merkel is much weaker than she has been, and consequently, I think the next crash we get, I think Europe's going to crash too. I don't think the UK would have been too much bothered with the euro, joining the eurozone, because we know how to have our own currency, and I think the biggest downfall of the euro. Problem with the euro is that no harmonization of anything before it was brought into being, and also the fact that the UK, the major countries like Germany's probably working with a currency 30% discount to what it should be. The UK probably would have been on par, but it's very detrimental to countries such as the Mediterranean countries, which could be working with a currency maybe 20% below what it is now, but they're not.
John, I have to say, I think you're right. I think there's no reason why Brexit can't be done without severe economic dislocation, but it's very difficult to see how the Eurozone breaks up without very big risks to the markets. And
absolutely.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I still think long-term it's the right thing to do. I take the political view, John, that had Europe been a cooperative club, it might have been a success, but it massively overstretched itself, and the euro perhaps being the best example of that.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll sign off and say to you, give my regards to Manuel.
Well, I certainly will. John, thank you. And I will be in Brussels this week, where I'm going to be meeting Mark Zuckerberg. Yeah, he's coming to meet the Conference of Presidents, the heads of political groups, and that'll happen on Tuesday evening. I will get the opportunity to ask him a question. It's not going to be videoed or filmed, but the event will be minuted. And I will, over the course of the next 48 hours, come to some of you and ask you what kind of areas and what kind of worries do you have about your personal privacy using Facebook. And I know a lot of people are very concerned indeed. Mick takes the view that Italy will cave in and toe the line because the EU will threaten them. Well, Mick, the EU will threaten them. The EU do threaten people, and the EU always seem to win by using those tactics. But there is a day coming when that is just not going to be the case. We could be very close to it. Anyway, you're listening to a Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It is now 10:30. Now, Italy could be about to blow up the whole European Union project, and I think it's a really major news story that is not getting the kind of debate and coverage that it should be, but it will over the course of the coming weeks and months. Mind you, not many stories really are getting much coverage in the newspapers today, because there was a certain event that took place in Windsor yesterday and everyone seems to be talking about it. To help me through this, I'm going to get people watcher Andrew Pearce, columnist and consultant editor for the Daily Mail, and of course, LBC presenter on Friday evenings from 7 till 10. And Andrew, you were there in Windsor yesterday.
I was, Nigel. It was memorable, actually. You never know what to expect. I covered the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton, which was great, but it was Buckingham Palace, it was central London, it was Westminster Abbey. The setting of Windsor Castle was just magical, actually. It is almost like a fairy tale location. If a Hollywood producer, Nigel, pitch a royal wedding, it would be Windsor with those glorious grounds, those glorious turrets and battlements. And the royals do pageantry so well. So after all the disasters of the build-up to the wedding with Meghan's father, Woody or Wonty, and those ghastly sisters and brothers saying terrible things about her, they pulled it as ever. They pulled it off, and it was a brilliant spectacle. And the atmosphere was extraordinary.
Yeah, but I was there on Thursday, Andrew, and so 48 hours before the wedding, and the household cavalry were doing marching and drill and practicing, and there were thousands of people. And I thought even on Thursday it seemed a pretty remarkable buzz about the place. And I agree with you. I mean, I was on the Fox News set, and it looked so unreal. It was almost like Disney. It looked so extraordinary.
I know. It is our version of Camelot, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's huge affection for Harry as well, because, not least, I think, because he lost his mother at such a young age. Everybody remembers that iconic image of little Harry, aged 11, walking behind his mother's coffin, which was heartbreaking to watch. And then to see him so happy with this remarkable young woman, who is mixed race. She's divorced. Wouldn't Diana approve?
You're probably right in that, in every sense, actually. But Andrew, he was the rebel prince, wasn't he? He was. He was the carouser. He was the party animal. He was the guy that broke the rules, and it didn't matter because he was never going to be king anyway. And I didn't seem to see many of his old drinking mates in Windsor yesterday. It seemed to be sort of A-listers. I mean, has she changed, Harry?
I suspect she's changed him a bit. I think all young men quieten down a bit. I know what I was like in my 20s, but I think he has tamed him a bit. I mean, there were one or two of his mates there, don't you worry. I spotted Guy Pelly, who was one of his drinking partners.
Yeah.
I think he was at that infamous party where Harry, who was only 18 for God's sake, was wearing Nazi uniform. But it was fascinating to see people like George Clooney and Amal there, and Idris Elba. Because you have to remember, she's a pretty accomplished actress in her own right. Suits was pretty big. I'd never watched it, of course, but I'm no great judge of popular TV, but it had a big following in the United States, a huge following in Canada where it was filmed. And boy, she didn't look nervous, did she? She was reveling in every moment of it.
No, she was a complete star in every sense yesterday. But parts of the service were, should we say, unconventional. And I wonder, I mean, how did the Duke of Edinburgh look during the sort of alternative sermon?
Well, if he stayed awake, that would have been quite something, because, you know, the Queen has a rule, speeches, sermons should be no shorter than 2 minutes, no longer than 7 minutes.
Yeah.
And our dear Bishop from Chicago went on for 13 minutes. He went on, and you could sense people. I mean, I think actually some of the younger royals were laughing. I'm sure Zara Phillips was chuckling.
Well, Charles looked like he was laughing, didn't he?
Yeah. They just knew he'd gone completely over the top. It was his great opportunity for this bishop, and he was completely hammed it up, didn't he? Every moment, every time it got to a certain point, I thought, phew, he's finished. And then he'd be off again with this great philosophical conversation about faith and fire. What was all that about fire anyway? I never did get to the bottom of that, really. I thought he was sent for the fire brigade or something. And there was very little about the couple, of course, but that's because, of course, he doesn't know them from Adam. But you know why he was there. He was a black bishop, and that was a symbolic statement because of Meghan Markle being mixed race, and because, of course, you know, the Queen is head of 15 states, and many of them are in the Commonwealth, and many of the leaders there are Africans and black people. So you get it, but somebody should have said to the bishop, 7 minutes and sit down, mate.
And overall, a good advert for the country?
Oh, it's fantastic, isn't it? I mean, you couldn't make it up. I mean, wherever I walked yesterday, there was TV being broadcast to the United States, to Canada, the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand. And I bumped into one of the local dignitaries. I think he was a mayor or something. And I said, this has really put Windsor on the map. He said it was already on the map. He said, but now it's gone on the map. 360 degrees of the globe. Fantastic. It must be worth tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, in terms of a showcase for Britain. I mean, how much would it cost to advertise Windsor in that way on TV worldwide?
Yeah, and I mean, Andrew, when you and I were growing up, there were voices in the House of Commons and elsewhere calling for the abolition of the monarchy. There was quite a strong strain of republicanism that had always existed, in fact, in this country. It had been there for centuries. I think they're going to be keeping quite a low profile now, don't you?
I absolutely do. And, of course, Jeremy Corbyn, we know, didn't watch the royal wedding. He was at some boring Labour economics conference. OK, he's the leader of the opposition. That's what he has to do. And we know he is a Republican, but he's made it quite clear if he was Prime Minister, he would do nothing to upset.
Yeah, it's not a vote winner, is it? It's not a
no vote winner. And you know, it's quite interesting. A lot of people are talking about why the Duke of Sussex. Little known fact, Nigel, the first Duke of Sussex and the only Duke of Sussex spent a time living in the United States shortly before or shortly after George III lost the colony. So the royal family picked that title for Harry and for her with great meticulous precision in all they do. The only one, so he's now the second one, and the last one lived in the United States for a bit. So that's quite symbolic.
And was a rebel, wasn't he?
He certainly was. He had 2 marriages, neither of which were recognised by the monarchy because he didn't get permission of his dad. Pretty tricky to get permission of his dad. His dad was George III, and if anybody watched the film...
He was crackers, wasn't he?
There was a film called The Madness of George III. He was round the twist.
Yeah.
So not easy to get permission from a monarch who's bonkers.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed for joining us this Sunday. Well, it was Andrew Pearce, who well, you could say Pierce is a cynical Fleet Street hack. He was blown away by what he saw in Windsor yesterday. And yes, we do wish the Duke and Duchess of Sussex very well indeed. Back to Italy. I'm bombarded by your messages. Kevin makes the point that it's a great shame these countries didn't take action before the EU bankrupted them. It will turn into a very nasty situation. Europe is in big trouble. I think Europe's in big trouble, Kevin. But as I say, I think the breakup of this project, the breakup of this currency, and I'm not saying it's going to come immediately, but I think the signs are there. It could be a very, very painful business. Tina thinks the euro's been a disaster, and so is Schengen. Well, why people still say it's so wonderful is beyond me. Yeah, but we had Jason on earlier, who was a strong defender of the European principle, and he blames bad management and bad government in Italy. But hey, they've always had bad governments. Ian is calling from Feltham. Good morning, Ian.
Good morning, Nigel. About the five-star movement and the Northern League.
Yes.
It's to me, it's like a stack of dominoes that are going to collapse all over Europe. Because you've got Syriza in Greece that tried their best to try and sort the problems out. You've got Marine Le Pen, who was kept out when the rest of them all ganged up against her, keep her out of office. You've got the Hungarian government that hasn't let any immigrants in at all, as far as I know. You've got Austria, I think, is lurching to the right. Because these countries, the people, not the countries, have been forced into a corner by the basically the European Union, which is basically the Bundesbank, or you could even call it the Fourth Reich, financially, if you like, by dominating Europe through finance instead of military power, and the people have just basically got nowhere to go.
The German point is a very, very important point. Matteo Salvini, who leads the Lega, and they stunned everybody by getting 17% of the vote. By the way, I saw an opinion poll on Friday putting his party now at 25% of the vote. So he is the rising star in many ways of Italian politics. But he wants to renegotiate the EU's key treaties because he says at the moment we are completely dictated to by the Germans. So there is a growing anti-German sentiment spreading throughout much of Europe. The question is, Ian, will these people stick to the plans that we've read about this morning, or will they back down? Will Juncker and the others put the thumbscrews on them and make them, as Brussels thinks, see sense?
I think they'll back down a bit. But it's a shame about Germany because I've talked to German people. They want the mark back. Yep. They want more independence for nations. And it's people being smeared by the behaviour of their own government and the Central European Commission.
Ian, do you know what? I'll bet anybody that it's difficult, it's retrospective, but had the Germans had a referendum on giving up the Deutschmark for the euro, Ian, you and I both know how they would have voted. And that is the problem. This European project's effectively been foisted upon people who didn't really want it. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC, and it's now 10:45. Is Italy going to blow up the European project, or will they back down in the face of Brussels telling them, do this, and your people will suffer financially very heavily indeed? Before I get back to that, John Bercow has been a regular feature on my show ever since I joined the staff at LBC. I am not a fan of John Bercow. I do understand that in some ways he's given backbenchers a little bit more power, a little bit more ability to speak in the Commons since he had the job. But I, for many reasons, don't like John Bercow, least of all because the Speaker, for 800 years, has been neutral. Even during the English Civil War, the Speaker managed to stay neutral, and we have a Speaker who is politically partial. Remember his comments about Donald Trump, for example. Well, he's in a lot of trouble now, I think. We've had a succession of stories about him, bullying is the accusation that gets made, but being pretty short with people, shouting at people. And this kind of got a bit worse, I think, at the end of last week, where he described a senior minister as a stupid woman, and he was referring to Andrea Leadsom. He also said she was effing useless. Downing Street has called this language and this behaviour unacceptable. So, for number 10 to say the Prime Minister thinks this is unacceptable means this whole thing has actually moved up a gear. And I have to say that even though there is no official investigation now going to happen into bullying, I think he is beginning to lose the support of the Chamber. He's pretty much lost the support of the commentariat, many of whom thought he was a bit pompous but thought he was doing quite a good job. And I have said that already. Quite a lot of backbenchers thought in terms of the job, he was doing it okay. It's just his personality and the fact that he isn't politically neutral. And I genuinely think that it would be better for Mr. Bercow to stand down, to resign, rather than get forced at some point out of that office in a very undignified way. That's my view. Back to Italy. Is this new Italian government a bigger threat to the European project than Brexit? Sarah is calling from Leeds. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning, Nigel. Well, my answer is I bloody hope so, because...
Now, why is everyone using the B word on this Sunday morning? But continue without using it, Sarah, please.
Well, I'm just delighted by the election results, and I just feel that now we're just turning the page. And I've just I've lived through growing up in Italy when we had the lira. Life was so much better before we changed to the euro. We joined the European Union, and I think it hasn't done the country any good. As you know, we all escaped Italy. People, when I go back, and people are pretty desperate about the situation, employment, everything else, and now the migration crisis is just...
and industry, Sarah. But I mentioned earlier, back in the 90s, when I was working in the metals business, my firm had customers in Italy, and they were the big industrial manufacturing giants of northern Italy. And kind of, in terms of their production, Sarah, they kind of challenged Germany in many ways 20 years ago.
Absolutely, massively. And now where all the manufacturers have been moved away from the country. And I just think, and I just don't mind what the EU is trying to do, like homogenize the whole continent.
It doesn't work, does it?
It doesn't work with different, that chap Jason before said, it's the fault of the Italian government. Yes, it is, because we have massive problems with the mafia and everything else, and the corruption in the government. But we managed before, and we're never going to be like Germany. Culturally, it is a massive different mentality.
Yeah. This is the key to it, Sarah, isn't it? How on earth Germany and Greece, or Germany and Italy, can be together? And it's not just a single currency. It's supposed to be a full economic, monetary, and ultimately political union. It isn't going to... Sarah, do you still have a vote in Italy or not?
Yes, I did. But I left quite young, so I have to say, I've never been really involved in politics. It's just in the last few years, I just took a real interest in, and now here in Brexit as well.
And which, Sarah, I mean, as I say, I know Beppe Grillo quite well, the founder of the Five Star Movement, and behind him there was a guy called Gianroberto Casaleggio, who frankly was
the techie...
Yeah, techie, genius, I think's the word I would use, Sarah. I mean, he completely understood the full potential of social media. He got Beppe, up to 4 to 5 million Twitter followers, huge numbers of Facebook followers. They set up a political party as an online platform. It's actually something I wanted to do with UKIP, but they weren't interested, sadly. But Casaleggio's now died. But for them to have gone from nowhere to getting 32% of the vote...
We've had, in my town where I come from, we've had, council, it was just hugely corrupt. People are getting arrested left, right, and centre when I was growing up. And we've had a 5-star mayor for the last 4 years. Mm-hmm. And there's been so much positive change. Actually, the money was being spent on the roads, on the town, on the park, just improving the town. It's just, and I do believe that Di Maio is a good guy. I hope they're not going to be persuaded or intimidated, because I do believe he's going to do what he says.
Well, Sarah, they are going to come under the most extraordinary pressure. Already, there are European commissioners telling them, don't do this, don't do that. It's going to be a battle royal. Sarah from Leeds, thank you, and she's thrilled at this new government. Christopher on Facebook says, this is a massive blow to the EU, physically and symbolically. All those Eurosceptic countries may do one of two things. They'll all walk away, or they'll all join together and become a nightmare for the EU. So, Christopher, about 10 years ago, a French newspaper said, Nigel Farage is Brussels' worst nightmare because he wants Britain to leave the European Union. In some ways, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, he's now the EU's worst nightmare, because he doesn't want to leave. He intends to stay in the club and break all of the so-called rules. June is calling from Dartford. Good morning, June.
Good morning, Nigel.
Hi there. So, how do you view this new Italian government?
Very exciting. I was just saying to your researcher, we've got the EU elections coming up next year. Get it flooded with new MEPs from Italy, Hungary, Poland, everywhere. Eurosceptic MEPs to carry on your fantastic work. This is coming from a UKIP member from Dartford.
Yeah, well, do you know what?
Carry on the fight.
Do you know what? After 20 years, I'm very pleased to be leaving. But in some ways, the next European Parliament promises to be a lot more fun than the previous ones. When I was first there back in 1999, I mean, Eurosceptics were rarer than hen's teeth. And there is now the prospect in this next Parliament of maybe a couple of hundred of them.
Is that all? I think we should
it may be 250. I don't know. It could be more. Let's wait and see. Thank you very much indeed. Because time running out. Going to go to Chris in Finchley. Chris, hello.
Listen, it's not all the EU's fault Italy's in the position it's in. Italy is not Britain. If it pulls out, it's bankrupt as it is. The Fiat Group moved most of its production to South America because it's cheaper labour. Italy cannot pull out of Europe. It's not like Britain. Britain has the money to pull out, Nigel. Italy is a corrupt, bankrupt society.
But Chris, my point.
On EC money at the moment. You know that, Nigel, yourself.
Chris, I do accept Italy has some extraordinary problems, and it really does. But that's the point, Chris, about joining the euro. And joining the euro isn't Brussels' fault. It's the fault of Italian politicians for agreeing to it back at the time. Exactly. But all the while they had competitive devaluation with the lira, they could keep their labour prices, for people coming in from overseas at relatively decent levels. They are stuck in some... I mean, Chris, for this to work, Italy itself has to go through fundamental social and societal change. And it just isn't going to happen, is it?
No, the Italians won't stand for... Listen, when the banking crash happened, Ireland had 80% austerity measures to get itself out of trouble.
Yes.
The Italians will not stand for that. You know that, Nigel. They will not stand for it.
I agree.
You take a British company called Dyson. You know Dyson's?
Yeah.
He moved all his production to Malaysia because it was cheaper, and we still pay the money for it. Britain is a very wealthy country. This country can afford to leave Europe and there'll be no problems, Nigel.
But ultimately, Chris...
Everybody knows that.
Ultimately, Chris, and again, another point to make that people don't hoist on board, it's the under-40s in Italy that are voting Eurosceptic. It's the young people right across Europe rebelling against the European Union. We have an anomaly in this country that our younger population are the other way. But, Chris, in the end, if the Italian people want to leave, whatever economic threats they face, they would in the end do it anyway, won't they?
Of course they're going to leave, Nigel, but they're already bankrupt. So blaming Europe is not the issue. The Italians are in their own destiny. They created this through corruption. You've done business in there. Listen, Nigel, I've been around a long time. I remember telling people it's 4 weeks for that part from Italy. You had to wait in August September, the whole of Italy closes down.
Yeah, I know. I know. Chris, I thank you. And Italy has got problems, but I have to confess it's still my favourite European country. Absolutely love the place. Well, interesting. Health tourism. It's a subject that I raised back in the 2015 general election to be screamed at, it seemed, from all sides. But now NH bosses have announced they're launching a crackdown on health tourism. People coming into this country from outside the European Union, having babies, getting medical treatment. They're now being presented with bills. Is it time we got tough with health tourists? And if you think it is, call me on 0345 6060 973. Maybe you think we must be careful. We're a civilised nation after all, in which case text to 84850 and tweet. Let me know what you think. Does something need to be done? Use the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. Watch us on Facebook and comment there too.
On your radio.